We all think Elizabeth I doesn't even remember her mother. She was only 2 when Anne Boleyn was executed, right? Wrong. History tells us Elizabeth erased Anne from her life, but the truth hides in plain sight. A secret portrait of Anne was recently found beneath Elizabeth's painting. The ring she wore, long known to contain her mother's image, was another defiant tribute. And a locket with Anne's A was worn in a court where even speaking her name was forbidden. Elizabeth couldn't honor her mother openly, but she remembered her symbolically again and again. And years earlier, in the shadow of her execution, Anne Boleyn wrote letters to Henry VIII, not to save her life, but to protect her 2-year-old daughter. And what that letter said might change everything we thought we knew about Anne Boleyn. By the end, you'll see her final words weren't about herself. They were her last act of love. If you want more hidden history truths, please like this video and subscribe. Every click helps us uncover the stories history tried to bury.
The Greenwich Palace, May 2nd, 1536. A tennis match, interrupted by footsteps. Anne Boleyn turns. A messenger approaches. She knows immediately. This isn't about the game anymore. Your Majesty, the King's Privy Council requests your immediate presence. 3 men wait for her. One of them is her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. But there's no family warmth in his eyes now. Only cold calculation. The charge? Adultery. In Henry's England, that means treason, and treason means death. What Anne doesn't know yet is that her own blood has already decided her fate. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was a survivor above all else. He had kept his head through Henry's shifting moods for decades by making one simple choice. Royal favor always came before family loyalty. When Henry needed someone to destroy Anne, Norfolk volunteered his own niece. Why? Because he had another niece waiting in the wings, Catherine Howard. He believed sacrificing Anne would secure his family's future. The irony? Henry would execute Catherine Howard too, just 5 years later. But in 1536, Norfolk convinced himself he was playing the game perfectly. He built the case against Anne with methodical precision, gathering testimonies, coaching witnesses, and ensuring even her childhood friends would turn against her. 4 days later, Anne sits in the same tower where she once prepared for her coronation. But this time, she's not choosing jewels or gowns. She's choosing words. Words that might save not her life, but her daughter's future. Her jailer is Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower. There's bitter irony in this appointment. Just 3 years earlier, Kingston had welcomed Anne to these same chambers as she prepared for her triumph. He had overseen her pre-coronation stay, ensuring her comfort, managing the ceremonies that would make her queen. Now he watches her every move, writes down her every word, waiting for her to say something that would make things worse. Kingston remembers the woman who had walked these halls in cloth of gold and ermine. The woman who had laughed with her ladies, who had planned her entrance into history. That Anne was radiant with power and possibility. This Anne is still fighting back, still sharp, but there's something else now. A mother's desperation. She asks Kingston about Elizabeth, constantly. Where is she? Who is caring for her? Did she know about her mother? Kingston's reports to Cromwell capture Anne's suffering. She fears greatly for the Lady Elizabeth, asking many times of her welfare and whether she might see her once more. The contrast breaks something in the hardened soldier's heart. Elizabeth, the little red-haired girl playing at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, while her mother's world collapsed around her. History tells us Elizabeth was too young to remember Anne, barely 2.5 when her mother died. But evidence suggests otherwise. And what Anne was about to do would ensure her daughter never forgot.
At 12, she appears in the great family portrait of Henry VIII. Look closely. She wears a pendant with the letter A, Anne's pendant. her mother's mark. In a court where even Anne's name was forbidden, the young princess wore it. Was it defiance or politics? We'll never know, but the symbol spoke louder than words. As queen, Elizabeth carried another secret, the checkers ring, a jewel she never removed, worn until her death in 1603. On the outside, it looked like any other treasure, but inside, hidden beneath the diamond, was a secret chamber. 2 portraits lay within, one of Elizabeth herself, and beside it, a woman in a French hood, almost certainly Anne Boleyn. Today, that ring rests at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country house in Buckinghamshire. Even her portraits carry whispers too. In the NPG 200 painting, recent X-rays revealed another woman's face beneath the paint. She wears a French hood, a fashion of the 1570s and 1580s. The sitter's name is not known. Some experts believe it was Queen Anne. Others disagree, yet the face matches no one more than Anne Boleyn. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. She was always there, with Elizabeth's own face, hidden from the eyes of people who accuse a mother in front of her child. Elizabeth could never honor Anne openly because of Henry VIII, but from the pendant of her childhood to the secret ring she carried to the grave, even to the ghostly woman beneath her portraits, she remembered, quietly, symbolically, always. But long before that, her mother was doing the same. In the shadow of death, when most think only of themselves, Anne was thinking of her child only. But that's what mothers do. They think of their child before they think of themselves.
May 6, 1536. 3 days before her execution, Anne requests writing materials. Kingston hesitates. What if she writes something that accuses others? What if she tries to send secret messages? But Anne was once the Queen of England. Some privileges remain. The letter she dictates that day survives in the British Library's cotton manuscripts, torn, faded, but still readable. It survived not because Henry saved it. He burned almost everything that was linked to Anne. It survived because Cromwell never gave it to Henry. He kept it hidden in his own files. After Cromwell's execution in 1440, the letter was found in his private papers. The Queen's last words, hidden by the man who had destroyed her. But why did Henry burn everything else connected to Anne? Because he wanted to erase her completely. Every portrait, every letter, everything that reminds of Anne, all fed to the flames. He ordered her coat of arms cut from buildings, her initials scratched from walls. This wasn't just the anger of a betrayed husband. This was complete destruction. Henry understood that memory is power, and he was determined that Anne would exist only as a warning tale. But one letter survived his purge, hidden in the shadows of politics. And this wasn't just any letter. Most prisoners about to die write about themselves. They beg for mercy. They say they're innocent. They protest their innocence.
Anne did these things too. She does something else too. Her letter to the king was a cry, the cry of a wife who was always faithful to her husband, the cry of a mother who didn't want to die, leaving behind her 2-year-old child, Elizabeth. Let me read you the most important part of her letter, the part that reveals who Anne really was when everything else was stripped away. Let not any light fancy or bad counsel of mine enemies withdraw your princely favor from me. Neither let that stain, that unworthy stain of a disloyal heart towards your good grace, ever cast so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife and the infant princess your daughter. Did you catch that? The infant princess your daughter. Anne isn't just defending herself. She's defending Elizabeth's legitimacy. She's reminding Henry that their daughter is a princess, not a bastard. She's fighting for Elizabeth's future with every carefully chosen word. But there's something even more remarkable about this letter, something that shows just how well Anne knew the man she married. She doesn't just beg, she warns.
If you have already determined of me, and that not only my death, but an infamous slander must bring you the enjoying of your desired happiness, then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sin therein. This is a woman telling the King of England that he will answer to God for what he's about to do. This is a condemned prisoner warning her judge about divine justice. But here's the most heartbreaking part of this story, the part that makes Anne's sacrifice even more tragic. Henry never read the letter. We know this because when Thomas Cromwell was executed 4 years later, Anne's letter was found among his private papers, still sealed, still unread. Cromwell stopped it. He decided that Henry shouldn't see Anne's final words. But why would he do such a thing? Maybe because the letter was too powerful, too emotional, too likely to make Henry change his mind. Or maybe because Cromwell knew something else, something about what Henry really felt for Anne, even at the end. There's an old record that came up centuries later, a note about Henry on his deathbed, showing grief for his fatal decision concerning Anne. Think about that. The man who had 6 wives, who executed 2 of them, who broke from Rome to marry Anne in the first place, that man died regretting what he did to her.
But in 1536, none of that mattered. Anne was alone in the tower with her words and her fears and her desperate love for a daughter who might not even remember her. What must it have been like for Anne in those final days, knowing that Elizabeth was somewhere in the palace, probably confused about her mother, knowing that she was about to leave her daughter in the care of the same man who was having her killed? The psychological weight of that would crush most people. But Anne wasn't most people. She had spent her entire adult life navigating Henry's dangerous moods. She had learned to read his silences, to anticipate his rages, to survive in a court where the wrong word could mean exile or death. And now, she was using every skill she had ever learned to protect Elizabeth. Look at how she structures her letter. She starts by acknowledging Henry's power over her. She admits her humble origins. She shows the proper deference. This isn't an accident. This is a strategy. Anne knows that Henry's ego is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. She knows that the right words, delivered the right way, might still reach whatever part of him once loved her. But then she does something courageous. She tells him the truth. Never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection than you have found in Anne Boleyn. This is a woman staring death in the face and refusing to lie. Not about her love for him, not about her innocence, not about his cruelty. She even mentions his new relationship with Jane Seymour, though she doesn't name her. That party for whose sake I am now as I am, whose name I could some good while since have pointed unto. Anne knew about Jane. She had known for months, but she chose dignity over desperation. She chose to focus on Elizabeth instead of her broken heart. The letter continues with perhaps the most politically astute paragraph a condemned person has ever written. "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges. Yes, let me receive an open trial, for my truth shall fear no open shame." This isn't just a plea for justice. This is Anne pointing out the fundamental flaw in Henry's case against her. Her accusers are her enemies. Her judges are compromised. Her trial is a sham. She's not just defending herself anymore. She's creating a historical record. She's making sure that anyone who reads this letter in the future will understand that she died for politics, not for adultery. And she's protecting Elizabeth again. Because if Anne is innocent, then Elizabeth is legitimate. But Anne saves her most powerful move for last. The paragraph that shows exactly who she was when everything else was stripped away. "My last and only request shall be that myself may only bear the burden of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of those poor gentlemen, who, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake, even facing execution.
Anne is thinking about others. The men who were tortured into confessing to affairs with her, the courtiers who were caught up in Cromwell's web of lies. She's begging Henry to spare them. This is the woman history calls ambitious and scheming. This woman who spends her final letter thinking about everyone except herself. Here's what makes Anne's letter truly special. What makes it different from every other last words document in history. She signs it not as Anne the Queen or Anne Boleyn. She signs it as your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn. Even at the end, she's claiming her place as Henry's wife. She's saying Elizabeth is legitimate. She's refusing to accept the story that she was nothing more than a mistress who got too big for her boots.
And then she adds one final, heartbreaking detail. From my doleful prison, the Tower, this 6th of May. Doleful, not angry, not defiant, doleful, full of sorrow, not for herself, but for what she's leaving behind. May 19th, 1536. Anne Boleyn walks to her execution. She has been Queen of England for less than 3 years. She is 35 years old, not the young woman history often portrays, but a mature mother who has lived through triumph and catastrophe. Her last public words are not about her. She asks the crowd to pray for the king. She asks them to judge her charitably. And then the swordsman from Calais, Henry's final mercy, ends Anne's life with a single stroke. It's over. But the story doesn't end there. Anne's letter, the one Henry never read, the one that was hidden for 4 years in Cromwell's papers, would eventually come to light. And historians would argue about whether it's real for centuries. Some say it's too well written to be real, too perfect, too exactly what we want Anne to have written. But others point to details that ring true. The mention of Norfolk as her enemy, the reference to Jane Seymour, the deep knowledge of Henry's psychology. And there's one detail that convinced many experts: the handwriting. The letter isn't in Anne's hand. It's in a scribe's careful script, but that actually supports its authenticity. Anne was under guard. Every word she spoke was monitored. What would have happened if Henry had read Anne's letter? Would it have changed anything? We'll never know. But we know this: Henry spent the rest of his life seeking the son that Anne never gave him. Jane Seymour died giving him that son, Edward, who would die at 15. His next 3 wives would fail to give him any children at all. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, the infant princess Anne fought so hard to protect, would grow up to become the greatest monarch England ever knew. Everything Henry wanted from a son, he got from Anne's daughter. She would rule for 45 years. She would defeat the Spanish Armada. She would turn England into the greatest power in Europe. Everything Henry wanted from a son, he got from Anne's daughter. And Elizabeth never forgot her mother, despite what history claims. As queen, Elizabeth, in her speeches, she would reference the woman who gave me life. In her policies, she would support the very reforms Anne had backed. That ring with Anne's hidden portrait stayed on Elizabeth's finger until her death. When courtiers asked about her jewelry, Elizabeth would smile and say it held my dearest treasure. Anne Boleyn may have lived 500 years ago, but her final letter reads like something a desperate mother might write today. The language is different, but the emotion is timeless. The love of a parent is willing to sacrifice everything for their child's chance at happiness. And maybe that's why we're still talking about Anne Boleyn after all these centuries. Because her story isn't really about Tudor politics or royal marriages or religious upheaval. It's about a mother's love. And that's something that transcends time, transcends power, even death itself. The letter Henry never read became the letter history would never forget. And maybe that's exactly what Anne intended all along. Anne Boleyn's greatest victory wasn't becoming queen. It was seeing something in her red-haired daughter that no one else could see. A future queen who would need no king to validate her power. In her final years, Elizabeth would look at portraits of her father and say,
I may have his throne, but I have my mother's heart. That heart, fierce, protective, uncompromising, had beat its last in the Tower of London on a spring morning in 1536. But its echo would resound through history in every decision Elizabeth made as queen. What do you think? Was Anne Boleyn the scheming seductress history painted her as? Or was she a mother doing everything she could to protect her child? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from royal history, because sometimes the most important letters are the ones that never reach their destination, and sometimes a mother's love is the most powerful force of all.